Elliot Voss was a prodigy, a name once whispered in academic circles as the next great mind of his generation. Until the world discovered he wasn't building the future, he was engineering death. Elliot Voss was not like other children. From the earliest stages of his life, he displayed an intelligence that was both fascinating and unsettling. At just 3 years old, he was reading at a middle school level. By the time he entered elementary school, he had already mastered advanced mathematics. His teachers didn't know how to handle him. Some were in awe, while others were uncomfortable, sensing something cold in the way he processed information, mechanical, calculated, without emotional attachment. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Elliot spent most of his time alone. His father had disappeared before he was born, and his mother, although loving, was overwhelmed. She encouraged his intellect but couldn't understand it. He spent hours in his room, surrounded by stacks of books, outdated computers he had reprogrammed himself, and whiteboards filled with complex algorithms and codes. Most children dreamed of becoming astronauts or superheroes. Elliot dreamed of controlling systems, of unlocking the hidden patterns that governed the world. At 16, Elliot made headlines in a few obscure tech journals for designing a stock market prediction tool that outperformed leading Wall Street algorithms. He sold it quietly to an anonymous investor and used the money to disappear from the public eye. He rejected university scholarships from top Ivy League schools, instead moving into a small cabin in rural Vermont, where he set up a private lab. He told reporters in a rare interview that higher education was too slow, too constrained by rules. He considered himself beyond the system, a thinker unrestricted by walls. What no one knew was that Elliot had already begun to see the world differently. To him, people were systems, bundles of inputs and outputs. He studied behavior the way a scientist studies bacteria under a microscope. He watched social media trends, economic shifts, criminal cases, and natural disasters. But more than anything, he studied failure. Why people broke down, why relationships collapsed, why successful individuals suddenly took their own lives. He fed this data into a growing program he called Mirage, a behavioral prediction model so powerful it could, in his words, map the collapse of a mind before it happens. Elliot never formed close friendships. He spoke to people when necessary but showed no interest in personal connections. Emotions, he believed, were weaknesses. His worldview was shaped not by empathy, but by logic. He found comfort in solitude and control, and the more isolated he became, the more dangerous his thoughts grew. One winter, as snow blanketed the cabin and the outside world became silent, Elliot had a breakthrough. Using the principles behind Mirage, he developed a new idea. What if he could not only predict failure, but engineer it? What if he could test how precise his model was by setting variables in motion and watching them play out in real life? This thought began to consume him. He didn't see it as murder or cruelty. To Elliot, it was an experiment, a proof of concept, the next phase of his work. He believed that if he could predict when someone would be most vulnerable, he could introduce a subtle nudge, a financial loss, a delayed warning, a triggered accident, and nature would take its course. No violence, no confrontation, just numbers aligning to produce an outcome. This was the birth of the idea that would later evolve into Vira, the app that would make him infamous. It began as a simulation, a test in digital space. But Elliot was no longer satisfied with virtual models. He wanted to prove his theory in the real world. The cold, brilliant mind that once sought to understand the world was now ready to manipulate it. Unseen, unheard, Elliot Voss was preparing to become something else entirely. A ghost in the system, a genius on the edge, and eventually a killer hiding behind code. The deaths began quietly. No screaming headlines, no national panic. Just a series of unfortunate incidents that, on the surface, looked like tragic coincidences. A 27-year-old tech consultant in San Diego lost control of his Tesla on a rain-slicked highway. A freelance graphic designer in Seattle died from a faulty space heater that caused a fire in her apartment. A cryptocurrency investor in Austin slipped from his balcony while adjusting a satellite dish. Each incident appeared unrelated. Each victim had a promising future. And each had recently installed a little-known financial app called Vera, had emerged suddenly in niche online forums and digital subcultures. Marketed as a predictive investment assistant powered by artificial intelligence, it promised users something revolutionary: smart, adaptive investment tips tailored to individual behavior and risk tolerance. It offered slick design, no upfront costs, and guaranteed confidentiality. It looked like the work of an ambitious fintech startup, but no founders were listed. The app had no official company name. Its domain registration was masked by privacy services, yet its performance was impressive, at least initially. Early users reported significant gains, and word of mouth spread quickly among digital nomads, online traders, and young professionals looking to multiply their earnings. What none of them realized was that the app was not truly designed for financial success. It was built to observe, to track behaviors, routines, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Every click, every transaction, every interaction with the app fed into an unseen machine. It watched how often users checked their balances. It noted who ignored warnings and who took unnecessary risks. It recorded which hours they were most active, how often they visited certain locations, and even cross-referenced metadata from other connected apps and devices. The more a user engaged with Vera, the more it learned about them, not as customers, but as subjects. Behind this hidden project was Elliot Voss. Now fully detached from the outside world, he had spent years refining his behavioral model, feeding it endless streams of public and stolen data. With Vera, he had created a live testing ground, an interface to interact directly with individuals who unknowingly gave him access to their lives. Each user was a variable in his grand equation. He was no longer just predicting breakdowns, he was orchestrating them. Elliot identified users who fit specific psychological profiles, those prone to impulsivity, isolation, or despair. These users were flagged as high-probability subjects. Once flagged, subtle changes began. Their investment tips would become slightly misleading, creating minor financial stress. Push notifications would arrive at moments of heightened vulnerability, during late nights, after recent expenses, or following social rejection. Vera began to nudge users toward physical and mental instability. Then came the manipulation of their environments. With the app's permissions and cross-platform integrations, Elliot could exploit the digital infrastructure users trusted daily. Smart devices in homes, cars with online controls, synced calendars and reminders. All of it became tools in his hands. For one user, it meant a delayed alarm and a misrouted GPS signal that led to a fatal collision. For another, it meant subtle, tampering with their smart thermostat, triggering a carbon monoxide leak. Elliot never touched his victims, never entered their homes. He simply set the variables, and the outcomes followed. Law enforcement didn't notice the pattern because there was no pattern to see. Different cities, different causes, no signs of foul play, no fingerprints, no motive, just accidents. Elliot believed he had created the perfect crime. Deaths that couldn't be traced back to him, all executed remotely through an app disguised as a financial tool. By the time 12 victims had died, Vera had already vanished from app stores. Only fragments remained online. The domain had expired, the user data wiped clean. But Elliot had the results he needed. His model worked. His theory had proven true. He had used data to identify and eliminate weaknesses in the system, and no one even knew he existed. Lena Hart had seen many strange cases during her time in cybercrime investigations, but something about the recent string of accidental deaths kept tugging at her instincts. They came from different states, had different lifestyles, and no immediate connections. Yet each victim left behind a digital trail filled with strange gaps and anomalies, missing calendar data, corrupt app histories, and irregular activity logs. To most, they were flukes. To Lena, they were signatures. Her curiosity was first piqued by a case in Chicago involving a freelance writer who died from a suspected gas leak. While combing through the victim's phone data, Lena found references to an unfamiliar app, Vera. She couldn't find it on any app store, but the digital residue of its presence was there: permission requests, encrypted logs, fragments of code. The app had embedded itself deeper into the phone's operating system than most consumer apps ever dared. That was enough to get her attention. Lena dug deeper. She cross-referenced similar cases and soon uncovered more victims with traces of Vera on their devices. It was like piecing together a puzzle where most of the edges had been intentionally burned away. But she was persistent. She had spent years as a software developer before joining law enforcement and understood how code could be used to manipulate and destroy. She followed the trail through online forums, abandoned GitHub repositories, and darknet message boards where whispers of Vera had circulated months before the deaths began. One phrase kept appearing in these underground discussions: Morpheus Protocol. At first, it seemed like nonsense, until she found a code snippet buried in an archived server. The protocol was real, and it was terrifying. It detailed a system that used behavioral analytics to monitor and influence users based on psychological profiles. It didn't just track users, it studied them, classified them, and eventually predicted their reactions to various forms of stress. The code was sophisticated, far beyond anything used in commercial applications. Whoever built it wasn't just a hacker. They were a visionary, and a dangerous one. Through long nights and endless lines of code, Lena began to reconstruct parts of the system. What she saw disturbed her. She found embedded scripts that could activate microphones without user consent, alter location data, and disable digital safety features. The app had been designed not just to monitor, but to control. Her investigation eventually led her to a cluster of IP addresses connected to a server farm in upstate New York. It was remote, isolated, and mostly inactive. Lena, along with a small federal team, moved in quietly to examine the site. Inside the aging facility, they found racks of equipment, some running, most powered down. Among the servers, Lena found one active drive protected by layers of encryption. She managed to access a portion of it, revealing what appeared to be logs of user interactions, detailed profiles, and even timestamps that lined up perfectly with the deaths under her investigation. But just as she began downloading the data, alarms blared. The room filled with smoke as a fire suppression system activated. Someone had programmed a failsafe. The system was purging itself. She grabbed what she could and ran as the building erupted in a small but contained explosion. The data was gone, almost all of it. But what she had recovered was enough. It pointed to a name that had long been forgotten: Elliot Voss. He had no online presence, no current address, and hadn't been mentioned in years. But his digital fingerprint, his unique coding style, was embedded in every line of Vera's architecture. Lena recognized it from a tech journal she had read years ago, one that had profiled a teenage genius who turned down fame and fortune to work in silence. That genius hadn't disappeared. He had evolved. Lena now had a target, not a company, not a criminal ring. One man, one mind. She knew catching Elliot Voss would be the most dangerous challenge of her career. He was always one step ahead. But she was no ordinary investigator. She had seen the dark side of data, and now she was determined to bring the ghost in the system into the light. Lena Hart knew she was dealing with a predator who didn't kill with his hands, but with silence, distance, and data. Elliot Voss had built an invisible weapon, one that left no blood but claimed lives all the same. Her limited findings from the New York server farm had convinced a select group within federal cybercrime units that this was more than a rogue app. It was a systematic and intelligent assault. But Elliot had vanished. There were no paper trails, no digital traces. He didn't just cover his steps, he erased the path behind him. For months, Lena combed through archived data, tracking any anomaly that echoed Vira's behavior. She found fragments, bits of code, half-formed URLs, orphaned commands running. In the background of devices owned by people who had once downloaded the app, they were echoes of Elliot's presence. He was out there, watching, perhaps still experimenting. The silence after the last known Vira-linked death was unsettling. It didn't feel like retreat. It felt like recalibration, knowing she couldn't rely on standard methods. Lena devised her own strategy. She created a fake profile, carefully designed to match Elliot's target archetype. She fed this fake identity into digital spaces where Vira had once thrived. She used burner phones, isolated servers, and dummy networks. Her fake subject was a financial analyst with a history of anxiety, living alone and showing behavioral patterns that Elliot's system would mark as vulnerable. She uploaded this data through a fabricated app designed to mimic the structure of Vira's interface. It was a gamble, an open invitation to be watched. Then she waited. Days passed, then weeks. But finally, there was a signal. Deep within her isolated network, a new piece of code appeared, elegantly written, hidden in an innocuous update. It wasn't just surveillance, it was a test, a digital fingerprint. Elliot had taken the bait. Through clever backdoors she had built into the dummy app, Lena traced the connection to a secure relay bouncing through multiple countries. But one node, located in the Adirondack Mountains, remained suspiciously constant. Using weather satellite metadata and power grid patterns, she triangulated the location of a high-tech smart home hidden in the wilderness, completely off-grid, surrounded by nature, yet pulsing with digital activity. That's where he was. A tactical operation was quietly approved. Under the cover of early morning mist, Lena and a small team moved in. No dogs, no sirens, just silence, precision, and anticipation. The house was fortified with surveillance drones and automated defenses, but they had studied the pattern and slipped through a blind spot. Inside, the home was more lab than residence. Dozens of screens displayed live feeds from cities across the country. Maps, financial records, biometric data, and predictive models covered the walls. There were no signs of panic. Elliot Voss stood at the center, wearing a simple gray sweater, as if he had been expecting them. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He just stared, calculating, calm, untouched by fear. Investigators searched every inch of the compound. In a hidden room, they found notebooks, pages filled with algorithms, names, and prediction models. These weren't just logs. They were future plans. Each name was accompanied by probability scores and detailed breakdowns of how they might die. Some were still alive. Others had already been tested. The horror was in the detail. Nothing was random. During his transport and questioning, Elliot never spoke. Not a word. Psychologists labeled him a high-functioning sociopath. He wasn't insane in the traditional sense. He understood right and wrong. He simply didn't care. In his mind, this was all research, a cold experiment on human weakness. He was sentenced to life in a facility designed for high-risk, mentally unfit criminals. Behind reinforced glass and constant monitoring, Elliot Voss sat each day, his eyes always moving, always watching. But something strange happened after his arrest. Copies of Vira's source code began appearing in encrypted corners of the dark web. Modified versions of the app started spreading again under new names, dressed in fresh skins. Elliot had ensured his legacy would outlive him. The genius had fallen, but the machine he built was still out there, learning, adapting, waiting.